All right, Errin Willenborg is with Winfield United Canada, providing something just covered up my screen, providing strategic direction on agronomy and field market development across Canada. Errin lives on a small farm near Floral, Saskatchewan, and Errin will provide tips on how to evaluate each field to prioritize which canola traits are most important. Here's Errin.
Yeah, right on, Jay. So just to kick things off, Jay had sent me a couple questions just to talk through today. I didn't put a presentation together, but to talk through in terms of how to choose the right canola cultivar for each field. And he first of all asked me to talk about, is that possible to have the right canola cultivar for each field? And I do think it is possible, and I think it's something that we should add to our decision-making process. I think having a conversation about choosing the right cultivar for each field really helps growers and agronomists to think a little bit differently about the hybrids they're selecting. You know, I think it's easy to say, is this variety have clubroot resistance? Is it a high yielder? Perfect. Let's move on. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think there's something to be said for risk management as well, and diversifying your hybrid selection. You know, reflecting on this year, I think some folks wish they would have looked at some different maturities. You know, maybe we could have chose a real early hybrid that was done flowering before the heat of mid-July set in. Some growers try new hybrids every year. And that's great, but I think it's more starting to think about why you're choosing those hybrids and how they may perform on certain fields is pretty important. Jay asked me to talk a little bit about how farmers, prioritize genetic traits on their farm and on each field. And I think one thing we need to realize and wrap our heads around is that there's a lot of great canola hybrids out there. If you look at the 2020 canola performance trials, for example, there was 16 replicated sites. And if you look within each herbicide system, there's really only a 4% variance in yield amongst those hybrids. So there's a lot of great choice and a lot of great yield potential hybrids on the market today. And those hybrids had a variety of options in herbicide resistance, disease resistance, and now perhaps shatter tolerance ratings, of course, maturity and standability, and they all yielded really well. So I think it's about digging a little bit deeper into that field history and looking at things like rotations, weed spectrum, and the disease history as Clint and Brittany talked about a bit today, and starting to couple that with experiences, trial data, and grower management to try to decide what's important. And I think it's cool to start to maybe get a bit more prescriptive with hybrid selection. I know that's pretty common in corn, and I think that's something we could look at trying here. If a grower is only seeding one hybrid, I would encourage them to try something new and think about why, not just something new for the sake of trying something new, but looking at some of the new genetics that you can introduce. And another example of that would be, if a grower's management practice always has them spraying quite late in the season, should we be moving a few acres over to the TrueFlex system where you can spray a bit later? Of course, staying on top of weeds and spraying them early is super important, but if that is part of your yearly management that you do get behind on spraying because you have a lot of acres, let's think about that and think about how that can be part of our decision making. One other thing that Jay wanted me to touch on was using genetic resistance traits in the canola hybrid selection process. And he asked specifically about blackleg and clubroot and how do farmers make the right decision on those traits. And I tried to answer that in one quick sentence, but it's really not that easy. I think, first of all, no matter what the disease, the grower, the agronomist needs to be out there scouting and paying attention and having good record keeping systems. I know there's a ton of them out there that people use to various degrees, but certainly keeping track of disease incidence and severity, as well as what hybrid you've been using is pretty important. So maybe I'll make a couple comments on blackleg and a couple on clubroot, and then I'll turn it back to you, Jay. But certainly on blackleg, Clint went through those major gene resistance packages and showed what was available. But if you don't have the field records of what you were using or what the specific R gene package was, what could you do instead? So if you've always been using one company or one R gene, perhaps there is an opportunity to switch if you see that what you're currently doing isn't working. You can certainly ask the company if they're not publicly sharing their R genes, if they know if it would be a good fit for you, or if they have really strong minor gene resistance. I think that's a conversation you could have as well. I know pathology is really different from herbicide resistance, but we're really good at paying attention to what herbicides we're using, and people are documenting it. Don't use too many group 2s, don't use group 9 too often, make sure you're tank mixing. And that's kind of a common conversation, but genetic resistance, especially around blackleg, it's not that common yet. So keeping those notes on what are the major resistance genes that you're using, or at least the varieties or hybrids that you're growing, at least you'll have those notes if something's going wrong and you need to look back. Of course, Clint talked about the IPM approach for blackleg, and so genetics is only one small part of that discussion. A fungicide seed treatment like Saltro can certainly help to manage that. So genetics is an important part of the conversation, and it's really built on field scouting and understanding what you've used in the past. Now, just a couple comments on clubroot, and I'll wrap it up here. But we know with clubroot, it's super important to take a proactive approach, right? Brittany alluded to it a couple times. Using resistance as part of that proactive approach is super important to keep those spore levels low and local. We always encourage farmers to use a clubroot resistant variety, even if they don't think they have clubroot. Those early infestations can be missed for years while the pathogen builds up to damaging levels. So, using a clubroot resistant variety, I feel like that's the easy part of the conversation, but it's often overlooked that resistance is not immunity. Okay, so to have a R rating to clubroot, what that means is that the variety has to have less than 30% disease infection compared to a susceptible variety. So those clubroot resistant sources can still get it infected, and it's important to really keep scouting. And there's areas where our pathotype composition is diverse, and maybe we thought for a while that we only had one pathotype, but when we started to look back into those galls, it was a diverse set of pathotypes. So we really need to be focusing on stewardship in combination with genetics. And it's an easy decision to choose clubroot resistance. There's a lot of great hybrids on the market today, but certainly around clubroot, it is more of a discussion on an IPM approach. And I guess just a quick word on second generation resistance. In areas where first generation has been grown a number of times, we're starting to move to the tough conversations about second generation. And why are these conversations hard? Well, there's not a lot of information that's publicly available on the source of this second generation resistance. And lots of people are talking about new resistance or second generation, and agronomists and I think growers are wondering, is this all the same source? And you know what, it probably isn't. And are all of these new generation resistance, are they resistant to the same pathotypes? And again, it probably isn't. So I think what can we actually do when we don't have all the information? I think it's really important to keep record of what hybrid you were using and the resistance source if known. If you're choosing a new resistant source, try to find out, what clubroot pathotypes it's resistant to, and eventually I think the technology will be really readily available to be able to understand what pathotypes you have in your field. So I know it's not easy today to figure out your club root pathotype. I know some work's being done at the U of A, and just switching to a new source of resistance might not be the right choice. Like Brittany showed a little bit of research on that wasn't totally completed yet, but you know, in some cases that could be a worse choice. So I know you'd love for me to tell you all the answers, but we just don't quite have enough information to know for sure. So just to sum that up, I would say scouting, record keeping, and working really closely with your genetic supplier to understand what they're offering.
Great, thanks, Errin.